everyone to More Than Geography, a panel conversation on the exhibit Mapping Home Collecting Truths. I hope you've had a chance to look at the exhibit a little bit before this, but if not, there'll be time after the panel to do so. Dr. Joe Bryan of the Geography Department, who's right here, will moderate the discussion and introduce the other panelists. So Joe is an associate professor of geography, and he's worked extensively on mapping projects with indigenous peoples in the Americas, including projects in Chile, Nicaragua, Honduras, Mexico, and the United States. He's the author of numerous publications on indigenous mapping, including the book Weaponizing Maps, Indigenous Peoples and Counterinsurgency in the Americas, co-authored with Dennis Wood, and his book is available for checkout in our library system, if you'd like to read it.
That doesn't happen very often.
So Joe, take it away, please.
Okay, well, thank you, Naomi. I'd like to just start also with some thank yous to Naomi, Ilene, and Phil. They've been three just fabulous support people here in the library for the Geography Department. And in past years, we've kind of had these pop-up exhibits during Geography Awareness Week where we've taken, or Naomi and Ilene have really pulled things out of their fantastic collection here and brought them up to the Geography Department, where we've done little kind of improvised tours that are always totally fascinating and really amazing. And it really is also amazing to see the depth of what's here in this collection that I think is kind of a hidden gem in the libraries here on campus. So it's my pleasure today then to sort of facilitate a conversation among an eclectic group of people who it's entirely my fault that they're sitting up at this table. And I'll say in advance, I hope that they enjoy the experience. But it's kind of a daunting task also to introduce them, but I'm going to try since I know a lot of you don't know them. So sitting to my right is, on the left of me, for all of you in the audience, is Phuong Vuong. She's been awarded fellowships from Tin House, Vona Voices, and Kearney Street Workshop's Interdisciplinary Writers Lab. She was the 2017 Joy Harjo Poetry Prize finalist. And she has publications in the Asian American Writers Workshop in the Margins, Duende, Cutthroat, Apogee, and elsewhere. She's an MFA candidate here in creative writing at the University of Colorado Boulder. And she didn't say this, but she does have a forthcoming book that I can't wait to see. Just the title alone has pulled me in. It's called The House I Inherit. To Phuong's right is Jim Miranda. Jim is a PhD candidate currently working on his dissertation entitled Border Transits, Crossing Deserts, Bridges, and Networks in Latinx and Indigenous Studies here at CU Boulder. His project confronts the violent history of borderlands while also revealing alternative geographical representations and practices of migrants and indigenous populations that operate within and against these material and conceptual constraints. In addition to working on his dissertation, Jim has a chapter in the forthcoming Latinx Cine, filmmaking, production, and consumption in the 21st century, coming out with University of Arizona Press next year. And his contribution to that deals with Alex Rivera's incredible film, Sleep Dealer. He's also currently co-writing an article on Moore and Gibbon's Watchmen as speculation on the demise of the humanities. And I have to say that I'm on Jim's dissertation committee, and he's one of those grad students that I have learned far more from than I have contributed to his project. So it's great to have him up here as a co-conspirator. And then to my left is the other geographer up here, Mike Dwyer. He's a political ecologist who studies land and natural resource conflicts in Southeast Asia. His research examines the legacies of Cold War geopolitics and present-day land conflicts in Laos, the politics of property formalization in both Laos and Cambodia, and governance debates about carbon forestry, road building, and energy development across the Mekong region. Mike's an instructor in the Geography Department and is also a senior affiliated research scientist at the University of Bern's Center for Development and the Environment. He's also here in part supported by the Center for Asian Studies. And Mike also didn't put this in his bio, but he's done some really interesting work with maps in Laos and Cambodia on sort of their role in titling land and sort of all the thicket of lines that brings to the surface. So our plan here today is to sort of share with you some of our reflections, our engagements with this exhibit based from our own research, and kind of start to explore some of the themes that are raised by it. And it's really, this is a conversation. We will talk for a while, and then we'll invite you all to join in with your questions. And I think that, a couple things sort of as we launch into this. One is that the title of this panel, More Than Geography, is meant as kind of a provocation. I think there's a real temptation to look at all of these works that are in this collection and see them as maps, because that's in some ways what the exhibit title asks us to do, mapping home, collecting truths. On the other hand, I want to kind of push back against that impulse. And I think that one of what's really interesting here is the more you spend time with the pieces, the more you're forced to take them on their own terms. And start to see new and sort of interesting things. And that's something that I hope that we'll sort of explore here. And I think that it also challenges, hopefully, people's ideas about geography. I know a lot of people still think geography is about memorizing capital cities and states. And I just want to say that this is borrowing from a quote that's in one of my colleagues' offices, that if that's all you think geography is, it leaves you at a real disadvantage, not only to see the processes of change, how the world is changing around you, but also to think about the world differently in other terms. And I think that's something that this exhibit really does nicely. So our conversation is going to be sort of organized around a number of key words from the exhibit title: maps, home, truth, collections. And we'll kind of work through that. But to get us started, I'd like to ask each of the panelists here to just give us a few comments on their response, reactions to the work. And I guess we'll start with Jim.
Okay. All right. So I had a chance to visit the exhibit a couple of times. And so I'll kind of frame my responses to it because they changed from the first time to the second time. So at first I was really struck by this tension between the pieces. And I started kind of sorting them, and there were some that kind of played with representations of movement, time lapse, and migration. And then there were other ones who played with imagery, symbols, and ephemera specific to the artist's home. So this tension between what we might call flights, flights, lines of flights or trajectories, right, movement, and this other kind of more symbolic punctums of crystallizing a place, something like that. And so this duality kind of framed my first initial impressions. And then the second time around, I began noticing how this tension doesn't really settle into these dualities. And so, for example, despite this realism and appearance of a scientific document of the National Geographic ones, where there's these birds, there was reference to the mystery of migration or the impossibility of knowing migration, right? And then there were these other ones, I really liked Alexander Swiftwater McCarty's Remember Where You Came From, which offers these superimposed figures and colors and designs to create a more fluid sense of home. So I started noticing how this fluidity allows for an account of overlapping historical processes, some that are moving and some aren't, and some that are more stable. And so my focus shifted from I guess what moves and what didn't move to begin thinking about how pieces confront the realities that kind of facilitate, force, or constrain movement. So that's kind of the two responses that I had to the exhibit.
Phuong?
Yeah, so for me as a creative writer, when I came in, I was actually already hoping to find some inspiration for writing, and I told Naomi, I'll debut a poem. Or that's actually, those are the words that she used. That sounds a lot cooler. But yeah, so I also looked back at some of my older work and found that there was a sense of mapping home. And for me, I thought a lot about home and language. And so I actually also want to respond by raising more questions that I don't necessarily have answers to, but some of the questions are, how do we find home in language? What are qualities that make language a home? Is it a sound in your body? Because we use different parts of our throats, our mouths, our lungs differently when we speak, and that actually, I think, also creates a vibration in our bodies that also, that literally resonates, right, and creates a sensation of home. Is home in a language about being understood, or is it also about being accepted when we are beyond or exceeding understanding? And also, how does then the visual arts come into play if the ways that we communicate, the language that we have access to changes because of movement or displacement? and how does dance, movement, theater come into play as well. But I'm not going to do art or dance for you right now. I'm going to read some poems as a part of my response. So I'll read 2 poems. All right, so the first poem is called Country of Origin. It's after a poet named Safia Abulo. It starts with an epigraph from the Oxford English Dictionary. It says, country, from Latin roots meaning against, opposite, and land lying opposite. Vietnamese word nước means water. Vietnamese word nước means country. Trong sống ở nước nào? Child, which country do you live in? Child, which waters do you live in? An ocean is a stream of water. Water you float in. Country you belong to. Salts and tans you. Marks citizen. Brown globe. If water equals country and water feeds lives, you survive on country. Therefore water is requisite for country. Therefore water makes country. But here a country lies opposite from me. A country opposite an ocean. So country opposite water. A homeland opposite water. A homeland lying opposite from water is my country. In what nook does this leave me? And this was something new that Jim heard a very early draft of. Kind of responding to one of the first pieces, if you're going down the stairs, a screen print, I think, called Mapping Kayak. And so this actually talks more about climate change in relation to home. And I think you just maybe should know that the grammar starts to fall away towards the end of the poem. So this is called Banoi, Rest at Sea. 1. Banoi, the water rises. What once worried me was never finding you. The grass grown high, a cemetery. A mile-long walk from which direction I don't know. My father asks a neighbor, help with your headstone's location. Another neighbor shrugs. The sun presses, calls out sweat, slip, my back, curved shoreline, vertebrae of relative lengths. We find the wide circle of your body's sphere, wipe the stone, light the stick, bow a few times. I sense the dead trace us. A perforated line forever tied, not always tight. My father wounds the twine, his secret layers, many faces, much guilt seeps. I stand in the sun, water rising. 2. Seawater laps against inland hills. Oil rigs falter as they will, as we will. Plastics, new factories, South China Sea, drilling heat homes are, water rises. Surrounding rice paddies, salt grain cellar, parched, a dry mouth, a moth upturned. You will always be home, even wilted grasses, perpetual flood, covered stones, sanitizing traces your breath on cement against the pitch of a country night. Crickets, echo, ripples, a new sea level.
Thank you. Sorry, Mike.
Great. I have to go after the poem. Somebody has to do that. Okay. So let's see. As I think Joe's introductory remarks really captured a couple of the ways actually that I experienced this exhibit the first time I saw it. Like Jim, I had 2 visits. And the first time, I was just caught by how much I wish I had seen this kind of thing happening in Southeast Asia where I work. And so as Joe said, a lot of the work that I do looks at the way that maps, often by various government agencies and sometimes by companies, do political work that's often pretty nasty and that involves trying to take land away from people who are using it and delegitimize other types of land uses that are going on. And yet some of these maps that I've come across in my research are just incredibly beautiful, and they really exist. A lot of them are hand-drawn because they come out of the pre-GIS era at the local government level where they don't have reliable electricity. And so I've been caught with this tension between the political work of the maps and the aesthetics, and seeing to use some of the language that Joe and others write about. I think of the maps in this exhibit, many of them as counter maps, and I see very few counter maps in the research that I do in Southeast Asia. And it was just on the one hand, I think it was limiting in the sense that my first read through this exhibit, I was reading most of the pieces as maps specifically. And it wasn't really until my second visit that I was like, wow, these are amazing pieces of art as well. So I guess that's one set of first impressions. And there was a phrase, where was it? From Deborah Cornell's piece, where it's in the case over here. It's number 14 at the bottom right, and it's a pretty medium-sized piece. It's really stunning in visually, and she writes, this print references pattern in the lake near my childhood home, the encircling radiance of light on water, which is to me always familiar and inevitable. And I was really struck by this pairing of the familiar and the inevitable as just a wonderful concept of home, as places that are familiar to us and somehow inevitable in the way that we feel about them. And it's, again, that was then taking me back to the things that I study and research, and how there is this sense of familiarity in many of the landscapes that people talk about, but there's anything but inevitability. And I think a lot of the themes that this exhibit wrestles with are the loss of the familiar due to processes that are anything but inevitable. Well, that sometimes seem inevitable, hopefully they aren't, but I really like this pairing of these two words in terms of thinking about home.
So I think that it's interesting to hear everyone's engagements with this, and I think maybe we should start just with the sort of most basic level, which is picking up on this theme that Mike just mentioned around maps. And there is a real sense that some of these pieces are both trying to work as maps, but are also struggling against maps as we think of them. And I was curious to hear responses from the rest of you about do these images work as maps? Are they maps anymore? Or are they trying to do something really different?
Yeah, well, I was thinking just on the most basic level, and I'm really curious to hear more about your work on counter maps and how you define that. But I think of them as counter maps without having a formal definition. If I was just off the top of my head being asked what is a map, I would think about where things are in relation to each other. I would think about people and their relationship to those things, and then also how perspective and purpose in mapping or documenting those things kind of come into play. So that's kind of where I'm coming from thinking about it. And we think of maps usually as authoritative sources, and so how do these pieces in engaging with memory, engaging with loss, question who has the authority to lay out a place. And one thing that came to mind when I was thinking about the question was an exhibit actually in a gallery in Oakland where they had a whole wall covered with a map of Oakland. It was mostly blank with just a few landmarks on it. And then visitors could go up and mark a place where they had a memory and kind of tape on a memory onto that map. And so collectively people were creating a map of Oakland, places where they've lived, significant experiences that they've had, and I think this kind of emotional memorial kind of work, especially in a city that's also changing and gentrifying, is really important. And I think that's what the artwork here reminded me of.
Yeah, along those lines, Jim, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about lines in particular, and one of the things that we come to associate with maps are we look for the lines, both in terms of boundaries, the graticule of the grid of latitude and longitude to kind of frame us, and those lines are oftentimes missing from these images down here, and I was curious to sort of pull a thread through those lines.
Yeah, so one of the things, when you kind of posed this question, I started thinking about how do I define maps, right? Which is a difficult question for me. Mm-hmm. So, but I was thinking this distillation of data, right? That has these overlapping spatial, social, and imaginary configurations, right? And that's also what's made me always skeptical of maps, because they work through a kind of selection and exclusion, right? What is left out, right, is partially where I think these maps are kind of offering us things that might not be on a map, right? So it's kind of maybe giving us a glimpse into what's been excluded from the maps that we're kind of familiar with in a lot of ways. So yeah, so for that reason, I've always kind of been like, and the reason why, where I'll try to like go back to this idea of lines, is to always think about how maps function, right? Or how this is a practice potentially as well. And so one of the pieces that I found especially intriguing in thinking about maps as a kind of a wayfinding instrument, right? And here I'm thinking of Ackerman, James Ackerman, who talks about wayfinding maps, and he argues that maps that are like wayfinding, they don't just tell us where we are going, but they tell us who we are. And so here's where I was really interested in like kind of tracing these lines, right? And in Claremont's North Crow Canyon piece, which I found really intriguing, the artist notes in the description the contrast between two directional ways of thinking about movement. The piece includes like a prominent letter T and an X. And Claremont says that the T stands for Trump. And it visualizes a kind of binary decisions that one must take when driving a terminal road. So when you come to a road, you have to turn left or right, right? Because there's no other way to go. That's one way of thinking about directions. And then here, so the choice is between left and right, but I think we can see that how other binaries work in this way as well, right? So we can think about how we map gender left, right? And we can think about all kinds of binaries that way. But the X, on the other hand, which is also in this piece, and it's kind of like a cutout X, and then there's another X behind there. So I was really interested in how the X as a graphic marker suggests a more complicated directionality that must account for plurality, right? As well as kind of layered patterns of crossing. So pieces like that I was really interested in, because if we're thinking about mapping as like wayfinding instruments, then we might start considering how, like in this seems like a very simple T versus X, but an X offers a much more dynamic way of thinking about directionality and what the map can do. So maybe that.
Yeah, so on those lines, I know, Mike, you referenced the fact that, these kinds of images or these kinds of maps, if you will, are something that you haven't found so much circulating in your field site, and yet you've walked lines with people and tried to make some maps or follow what the maps show. And I was curious if that sort of experience that Jim was just referencing resonates at all with your work in Laos.
I don't know. It's hard to. It's still. This is to me one of the things that's been so great about this exhibit is for me to find similarities in terms of the services themselves and the representations. The themes that the maps deal with are very much bread and butter for the kinds of things that I'm seeing and studying and dealing with in Southeast Asia. But still, it's much more a contrast in terms of the experiences that I've had there, in terms of the way that these kinds of things are used. I wondered, I did want to reflect on the maps question, though, and that there are, and again, I also want to thank Naomi, Ilene, and Phil, all of whom I have bothered a number of times for my classes here. I just had Phil in my class this week, and we were talking about visuals. And so as part, because I teach a senior undergrad seminar on doing research, and we do a lot of nuts and bolts related to different parts of producing a thesis. And this was Visuals Week, and so part of that process, I had assigned a chapter from a geography methods book, and got to go back to sort of look at the original cartographic theory about what a map is supposed to be. And it's like you start with the reality, and then there's this translation from reality to mapmaker, from mapmaker to paper, from paper to viewer, and then from viewer back to the reality in the head of the viewer. And it's this very scientific idea of what a map is supposed to be. And I think that's, I tend to view most of the maps in the exhibit here through a very different understanding of what a map is. And when Joe posed the question, Nicholas Rose's definition of a map as a little machine for producing conviction in others came back to me a couple of times. It's sort of a very general definition, but I think it really fits a lot of the maps in this collection here. And then I also then folded back on to the original definition, and was especially struck because of the work I do on forests in Southeast Asia by the Standing Rock map, which I think is an amazing example of sort of a more scientific map that really captures in some pretty strong statistics the enclosure of that whole landscape. And it included, the passage that I wrote down, was that the dams that were built on the Missouri River by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers flooded 200,000 acres of Standing Rock Reservation and destroyed 90% of the remaining trees. And it's those kinds of pretty hard facts that I think also, when you can really put them in conversation with the map as a machine for producing conviction, to me that's when these things really have a huge amount of power.
Yeah, there's this idea that maps somehow tell us the truth, and in geography, it's an old saying at this point, cliche almost, that maps are always lies, right? They are only selectively telling us what's there, and in fact, they wouldn't work if they couldn't eliminate so much and reduce it down to its kind of simple or essence language. And that's where I think there's an interesting comment here too along place. I mean, all of these works are really very much involved in place, and yet place is something that they don't ever settle on a single definition, obviously, but they start to give us some ways of thinking about it. And I was particularly struck also by the images that show like the middle of the ocean, or mapping by kayak, that are kind of play with this idea. Maps are such a tool for wayfinding, and they were such a tool of moving on the ocean, but then when they went on land, they kind of took on this whole other life as the stuff of colonialism, states, empires, so that now like oceans appear as the kind of unmapped places. And in thinking those things through, it's I think one of the things that's interesting is that none of these are trying to approach place as having a meaning that derives from some long internalized history. This is kind of a feminist geographer Doreen Massey's take on things, but rather seeing place as constructed out of a particular constellation of social relations that meet and weave together in a particular locus. And that's from Massey's work. And I was curious to hear how each of you are kind of approaching this concept of place in these maps and trying to sort of decipher or responding, engaging to what's going on with the images. I think it was something I was really thinking about, Phuong, with your poems, listening to how you were sort of narrating place, not by telling us what's there, but by giving us lines to think with, or sort of putting it in conversation with other things.
Yeah, I think, that's really important to me, and I also really appreciate that quote of just like we aren't inherently necessarily belonging to a place, but that these relationships help us make that relationship or help place have meaning to us. And I think that's something I have been really interested in, is just thinking about memory. And I think especially when people are displaced and migrate, how does then a place become something of particular value in a memory and something that haunts us? Like, I was also really struck by mapping by kayak, and there's also the one that you mentioned, remember where you come from, where there are petroglyphs, I think, layered on top of one another. And I think what's really interesting about those images is that the artist layered on images that are disjunctured, right? It's not like a linear process. It's not something that you can, in the most literal sense, find in that place. And so I think they represented place through symbols that I think show their relationship to that place. I thought it was really interesting too that the artist who did mapping by kayak, she also wrote about her grandmother and how she returned to her ancestral lands, and how that relationship was a part of mapping the place. And I think that that's partly what it means to me, that when you are displaced, when you're driven out, or when you have very few options to choose from, if any options at all, a place becomes a haunting of a sort.
Yeah, no, that's great. I like that idea of haunting, because there's this who lives where they're from anymore.
Yeah.
Like nobody lives at home. We're all constantly being moved. And I think that, Jim, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, because I think there's a sense that, like, especially when something is coded as indigenous art, that it's supposed to tell us something about only one place. And I know that you've also explored this at the other end of this tension, where if you're the migrant, you can only tell us about how you left that place. And I was curious to sort of hear where place fits into that, or how that squared with your reading of it, or take with the
Right,
works.
yeah. Well, I mean, I've always felt like this kind of discomfort, right, with this, like, the dwelling on, like, belonging or security that involves place. So when I was looking through the exhibit, one of the, like, pieces that really stood out to me was, like, this it was almost like a refusal to kind of have, like, a faithful belonging to home, right? And I think it was called No Way Back. And it just has, I'll try to describe it really briefly. It just has, like, the word there, long way, here. And that's all it is, right? And I was like, what kind of map would this be, right? And so one of the things that I really kind of appreciated about it, and what the author, the artist was kind of echoing in some ways that I think about in my work, is that, and I'll just quote from the artist. She says, "Home is a complicated idea for me. It's a place of conflict and abuse." And she says, "I could not wait to leave." Right? So this really complicates our idea of home, complicates our idea of place. And so I guess for me, I became interested in the exhibit because what kind of, I guess, valences open up onto, like, new articulations of home when we have this kind of diaspora or migration, when we put these in conversation with what we think of as home. And I think that's where it becomes really interesting, because then home can take on different meanings for different people and have a much more, just much more open way of thinking about home. But then there's this other part, and I'll just quickly read this passage. It's really kind of heartbreaking, from Zit Kalasa, who is a Native American author, and she returns home after 3 years of schooling, and she decides to go to college, and her mother's not happy with her, and she says, "You had better give up your slow attempt to learn the white man's ways." And Zakala notes that she notes that she's being deliberately disobedient, right? And she says, "Thus homeless and heavy-hearted, I began anew my life among strangers." And so, like, this passage is both heartbreaking, but it's also, I don't know, it just makes me really think about the kind of minimalism in that piece, and how is there ever really a return, or is there never going back once you leave home too, which is a reality that I think kind of some of these pieces are confronting in some ways.
Yeah, Mike, your stuff you've looked at how maps are used to kind of fix people in place, and how there's sort of a complicated triangulation that goes on between people's attachments to those places and the livelihoods that are possible in those places.
Right.
But then also being kind of locked in or boxed into that. And I wondered if there was any resonance.
Yeah, so certainly there's, and this came up, I forget where, doesn't even matter, but in a conversation that I was in recently, where there's this sort of official narrative or dialogue where people get moved around and, locked in by official maps, and then everybody knows and basically accepts that people are then going to go farm or live somewhere else and do all these other things, and these two worlds are sort of going on at the same time and very much in tension with each other. There's a neat piece that's sort of halfway down the stairs that has, it's a binary image, and on one side there's a snail, right? And the snail is the representative of the person who takes their home with them always, and sort of leaves home or leaves the place and then creates it anew, and then it's juxtaposed with the GPS point and the little teardrop that we see in Google Maps, and it's like it's about navigation as a counterpoint, I think, to place in a way to think about home. one of the things that really jumped out at me in terms of the what Joe pointed out about thinking about places in terms of their relations with each other was Lindley Logan's work, where he talks about Native men serving in every war in this country's history at the highest percentage of their population compared to other cultural groups. And then it's the sentence after that that really struck me. They returned home after fighting for other people's freedom to have their own freedoms denied in their own country. And it's that relationality that they're in Southeast Asia, there's all this, if you read sort of the trashy pulp nonfiction about the Vietnam War, Native Americans play a really important role in that, in the way that the US fought the guerrilla wars in Vietnam, because they were supposedly better at navigating the jungle landscapes than the non-Native soldiers. And so there's this imagery and home that's sort of locked up with US imperialism on both sides of the Pacific in terms of the way that that piece in particular spoke to me.
No, I think that's a really powerful piece, the kind of serial dislocations that you start to access if you go into any one of the places in these works. It starts throwing you off and pushing you down new paths. So I think maybe just to sort of conclude with our piece and then open it up to people's questions from the audience, I was curious, just, putting all these things together is kind of a daunting task. I'm impressed that Naomi had got them all kind of together, and that it's actually, it's a bit sort of the way our minds work to always want to sort of figure out some structure or some story to tell from start to finish. And yet, anytime you do that, you just kind of get this cacophony of like voices. And I was kind of struck with this idea that like this is kind of like a noisy atlas to a world that's still yet to come, or worlds that are still yet to come. And I was curious to hear sort of if that resonated with any of you. There was one piece in particular that I was thinking a lot, because the word atlas has all these kind of interesting connotations. Obviously, there's the classic hero, the Titan who holds up the earth. There's also the collection of maps. I also recently learned that it's the name of your topmost vertebra that holds your head. And Jean Quick to See Smith, who's an artist actually I've followed for quite a while, partly because she's worked from an area very near to where I grew up in Montana. But she has, her piece down there is called The Longest Journey is from the Head to the Heart. And I was starting to kind of play with these ideas like atlas, and I was curious if I was totally off the deep end, or if any of this kind of cacophonous gathering of things or collecting of truths was something that resonated with the rest of you.
I had something similar, but I started like noticing all the animals. Like there's like so many animals in these maps, and I started calling it like a radical zoology or something, right? So something similar, like this collective act of world making that spontaneously maps how indigenous knowledges are grounded in like a shared inhabitance or something like that, right? Or sharing with these other species or something. Because as you look at each map, and it's not like they all got together and did them, but you start noticing these kind of patterns. So. That's kind of one of the ways that I saw these coming together in a really interesting way, and you could see all the different animals, like some realistic, some more stylized, some more design-wise, kind of even cartoonish or whatever. Like it was just really amazing to see all these. So I started thinking of it that way, and also how that challenges us to move backwards from the map in a way, to start thinking about how we might organize information and to think about information before we start plotting it or putting it in some like this kind of like fixed form, right? Just to start thinking about the content itself in a strange way, which I've been really interested in my work lately, in moving back from the map, because the map just takes up so muchroom. Sorry, so I don't know if that's a good. It takes up so much room in critical cartography that like I want to kind of like, well, what happens to like these other things like surveys and censuses and all these other ways of collecting information that might be just as important and might lead us down different roads, open up new potentialities, etc.
Yeah. I had a hard time thinking of some of these like responses to some of your questions, since I felt that same like, I don't know, almost like this asterisk, this network kind of building in my mind of all the possible things I could say. But I think one thing I come back to is similar to that quote, the movement between the head and the heart. And I think it might be not your definition of counter mapping, but I think how do we map things in relation to emotion? I think it's so important. And moving away from some sort of like strife or like objective knowledge, so that we actually include a relationship between people and the relationship between the natural environment too, which maybe it's one of the reasons why the animals keep coming up. I know one of the questions you also were going to move on to was around like indigeneity and that term, and I just kind of want to bring it up that, and also when I visit, Naomi brought that up of like, can we see indigeneity as international or define that more broadly? And I thought that was a really difficult question, and I'm definitely not, a scholar in this idea, but it did make me think about like, where are there people who, that are difficult to connect with because of where they are, physically or in relationship to technology, like, can they use that term? And then also, if I'm Vietnamese, am I indigenous to Vietnam? But then I know that there are also indigenous groups in Vietnam who aren't recognized, so maybe they deserve that term more in order to kind of take up that space. But then also all the questions around, all the problems, I think, too, around waiting for recognition from, the state, for example. So those are some of the ideas in my head as well. And I also just want to mention, I think all of us are interested in problematizing migration. And so recently I was reading a book by Lisa Marie Cacho called Social Death, and she talks about the right not to migrate. And so, if we are only focused on the right to migrate, how are we also forgetting that there are all these forces, policies that are forcing people to make that decision, or not giving them the decision at all to stay. So I think that's just important to slip in there as we close out.
Yeah, I really wasn't sure what I was going to say in answer to this question, so I guess thank Joe for the lifeline of the atlas. I think that really works for me. I was trying to think about, what themes, is there anything that ties all of the things, beyond simply the title of the exhibit as a whole. And I was trying to make sense of relationship of adversity to home and landscape, but that seems ultimately pretty thin to me, and so I like any kind of a metaphor that allows for multiplicity and cacophony, and I think atlases do that really well, but especially when they have their spine torn off and you can have the pages just pasted all over the wall. One of the, I think, really my best memories of being in the map library was earlier this semester when Naomi and Ilene pulled out maps of Southeast Asia and just put them all over literally all the tables downstairs. And we had 2 classes in a row down there. And we just got to play around and look at the way that Southeast Asia had been represented through maps over time. And having that multiplicity of the way that things play off each other and really speak to each other in very different ways depending on the order that you look at them. I think that's one of the nice things that can happen when you have an atlas that's able to work in different orders.
Yeah. I want to make sure that we have some time for people from the audience that have been listening patiently to ask questions, comment, complicate, provoke. Yeah.
So I'm curious about, this is maybe more of a general question, but because maps are so entangled with colonialism and Western conceptions of linear time, as such a colonialist project, are they ever capable of being a colonial project or of deconstructing it in some way?
So seeing as it's come up a couple times, I'll take the moderator's privilege here. This was the premise of counter mapping initially, was to say maps have made the world that we live in many very sort of material ways. I mean, maps as we know them today didn't really exist prior to 1500, and the origins of modern cartography or cartography as a science really come right out of this moment when colonialism is starting to become a thing, and eventually when states become a thing. So you have to look at these things as co-evolving. And the idea was like, if we want to change the world, we need new maps of it. And this is an idea that resonated with a lot of people all around the world, but in my case, I've followed how indigenous peoples have picked this up and made their own maps of places so that like literally we can see the place that is buried beneath maps that's underneath our feet. And I think that one of the tricks that's come around is that it's produced new recognition of indigenous territories. We can stand here and acknowledge the fact that we're on Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne territory. And that moment of recognition, though, doesn't always lead to an actual transformation in the social relations. And that's where kind of a lot of the countermapping stuff has become really hung up. And I think one of the things that I was getting, and I really like hearing from everybody else about this, is that these are maps that aren't necessarily trying to change the world so much as they're kind of turning that old phrase that Marx took from Hegel when he stood Hegel on his head, and they're trying to interpret the world. Not in the sense of revealing anything new, but in the sense of being like, what are the traces in our relationships to places, our memories, that we can pull forward and put into this, communicate, share with others, that might give us clues to like other possibilities for what this place might be right now. And I think that's like one of the real take-home messages from me, at least from this, from both the exhibit, but then also from listening to, I mean, Phuong's poem did what I just did, but 10 times more eloquently. So I don't, I think your question is spot on, though, and I think that Mike, I know, has wrestled with this question some, and Jim's hatred of maps, no. Jim's critique of maps is right along in the same vein.
So I wonder, just as a follow-up, if some of these like counter mapping, as you're saying, allow for like more spatial subjectivities to arise, if we think of that sort of deconstruction of place and rather indigenous ideas of land. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sure, I can say a little bit. I think, to me, one of the, there's a great image from Joe's book that shows a counter map with all of the content that matters whited out, right? And so the point is not what the map shows to the audience of the book, but what the map shows to the people who are actually allowed to look at it. And I think this notion of maps and viewers being contextual and highly political, I think, is wrapped up in this question. I don't know that there's a good answer to your question. I think it's really worth posing. I guess I'll just share a short story from the class that I have been teaching on Southeast Asian environmental politics. A couple of weeks ago, we read a constitutional court case from Indonesia that gave recognition to indigenous people in Indonesia by cutting the word state out from the definition of customary forest. Before 2013, the forest law said customary forests are state forests that are used traditionally. And by excising the word state, it redefined forest from being a politically defined entity to being a historically, biophysically, culturally defined thing. And it opened up all this space to do mapping to actually operationalize this new form of recognition. At the same time, the definition that it allowed for was very limited because it said in order to gain these newly recognized rights, you have to conform to the 1945 definition of what indigenous people were, which the newly independent state of Indonesia basically took from the Dutch colonial period, which said it's people who are very traditional, they live in longhouses, they don't have a division of labor. And so now there's this very strategically informed interpretation of this in order to produce these counter maps to attain rights. But it's this very mixed up process that I think like Joe said, your question is spot on, that wrestles with both of these, the dualities at the same time.
There's an image it's called Eye Dazzler 2 by a Dene artist, Will Wilson. And it looks nothing like a map it looks like a weaving, and then you look at it closely and you realize that it's a photograph of an image that's made out of beads. And then at the center of it are QR codes that you can scan with your phone, and then you get a video of the artist on Dene land giving you these panoramas of himself with a GoPro and with cameras. And he describes this really well, and I think that this is like the thing that this captures the sentiment of what at least I wrestle with a lot, where he says that the work is about the quixotic relationship between a post-apocalyptic Dene man and the devastatingly beautiful but toxic environment he inhabits. And I think that that's, I mean, how do we find a home between those two things? That's a question that is provoked or comes out of that engagement. Yeah?
Do counter maps have lines? Or by definition, if a map has a line, is it therefore not a counter map?
That's a good question. I think most of the
It's a
counter
new idea to me.
So most of the counter maps I've made have been explicitly and have worked with have been explicitly formulated to take back land from states or from governments. And so lines are oftentimes very important things to draw on the map in the sense that they give the state something to recognize and says this is an indigenous territory or a community property, and it has a line around it. And I can tell you from making those maps that when we go out to actually figure out where to draw that line, we get drawn into a whole bunch of complexities around how that line does a lot of violence to how people live on this, in the place that they're at. And so every project I've ever been a part of as a cartographer, as a researcher, we're always sort of working between the lines that you have to draw in order to achieve some level of protection or recognition from the states, and the way that those lines make your life complicated or operate kind of at odds with your life. And so there have been other times when I mapped, like maps that I made with Western Shoshone people in the few states over here in Nevada. They didn't want to have any maps or any lines on the map. And they're like, this is an open space. And when we went back and actually read the treaty they signed with the US government, it doesn't draw a line either. It just references 4 points on the landscape. And then, of course, the US government then drew the lines to connect those 4 points to make, you know, this narrative form into. And so there's all this kind of interpretation and translation that comes along with lines.
Did the Shoshone themselves see a point at which anything beyond that was no longer their space or whatever, however they imagined? Or was anywhere they were was where they are?
Yeah, well, the group that I was working with, I mean, they were kind of like, we need to interpret the dynamics of what's going on, like why we are where we're at today, why we can't move around. And so we were constantly coming across real lines. I mean, try to sneak onto the Nevada test site to map cultural sites in a high security federal zone. I wasn't going to do it. But, you know, so those lines have real consequences. It's not like they're just lines on maps. But we started to play with, like, you know, well, what's the difference between a line on a map and a line what kind of material consequences does that line have? And it became really difficult. And the 2 Western Shoshone women that I was working with, they just said, you know, we're not going to draw those lines now. We're going to say, you know, the US government has basically stolen our land from us. And we want some acknowledgement of that theft as a precondition to any other kind of conversation. And that was what the US government was not at all willing to concede.
But they perceived that this specific space, place on the landscape as theirs?
Theirs is a tricky word. I mean,
Yeah,
it comes with this idea of property and ownership. And you know, I think if you look at a lot of the images down here, there's a lot more of a dialogue, like we belong here, but we're kind of this place, or we belong to this place too, right? And then there's this kind of, this interplay there that is really complicated when you try to put on a map. And that's, I think, for me, at least as a scholar, that's been where a lot of the concepts that are in these works here actually have material force, because you realize that you're the sort of the temptation of the geographer or the lawyer or whoever is always to take every point that's in an image like what you see right around the corner here and pinpoint it on a map and say, this is where this is, and this belongs to this person. And I think that's, for me at least, one of the messages I take from these works is that they're destabilizing that logic at every step.
I would suggest maybe the way of thinking would be analog versus binary. So that you have Utes here and Cheyennes here, and there's a general boundary of contention that might be claimed by both. And so instead of a line, it's a fuzzy space,
Yeah.
an analog space.
No, it's protocols for moving, right?
Mhm.
I hope that everybody gets a chance to spend some time with the exhibit. And Naomi and Ilene have put together this fantastic book that has pieces from all the artists' statements that are actually much longer, I understand. But this is a really intriguing document to see the images with, although it's like, it's like Jim was saying, it's two different experiences to see it the first time and just absorb it visually, and then the second time in reading and sort of putting these things in conversation. Well, thanks for agreeing to do this, to Jim and Phuong.